All right, welcome back, everybody. And our final session this morning is Building Innovative Solutions to Student Homelessness. And our moderator is Stephanie Hanenberg, Executive Director of Health and Wellness, Recreation and Wellness Center, University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and also the President of ACHA.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's final panel discussion titled Building Innovative Solutions to Student Homelessness. As Kellen said, I'm Stephanie Hanenberg, and it's my honor to be the moderator today. I'm going to let the panel go ahead and introduce themselves really quick before we get started. We'll go ahead.
I'm Meg McKeon. I am the Interim Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Dean of Students at Purdue University Northwest in Hammond, Indiana. And I have in the past been one of those senior administrators we've spoken about this morning in being a Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jillian Sitjar, and I'm the Higher Education Program Manager at Schoolhouse Connection, which is a nonprofit here based in DC with the mission to overcome homelessness through education.
And how do you do? I'm Jeanne Harris-Caldwell. I am Dean of Wellness, Social Services, and Child Development. I am also the President of California Community Colleges Health Services Association. Thank you for allowing me to be here.
So for this discussion, we're going to seek some practical solutions to assist students with housing gaps, determine what administrators need to know in this arena, trends, and short and long-term solutions. The goal of this panel is to have the most robust discussion on this topic, so please feel free to ask any questions via Slido, or we'll maybe have an opportunity at the end for in-person questions. So we will go ahead and get started, and we are going to keep this informal. You guys chime in whenever you want to. The first one is, programmatically, what are we seeing on the ground today in terms of helping students find housing?
I think from the California Community College perspective, we serve more than 2.1 million students, and I think that there's a strong collaboration with community agencies currently that's ongoing. In our current CCC Apply, it's our online application, we now have the ability to ask if a student has housing insecurities on our application process, and newest data shows that we had about 37,000 students actually self-identify of the housing needs. So I think that as colleges and higher education institutions that were the need for collaboration to continue with many partnerships, including programs and research institution data like Hope Lab is very important so that we can look at the magnitude of this problem across the nation.
So within my role, a lot of the roles and responsibilities for me is just research. So that includes reaching out to folks in different colleges, institutions to figure out what different resources, services, and support they are providing for students who are experiencing homelessness. And time again, the biggest challenges I kept seeing is, what do I do about housing? And so we really like to highlight schools that have an emergency housing program, and that's particularly for students who do have residence halls, which are those four-year institutions. And Sacramento State has a really robust emergency housing program where students can stay there for up to 30 days, and during that time period, they're allowed, or they have a case manager that's working with them to find a long-term permanent solution. And they also have a meal plan option, which is really great because, as we know, we really can't talk about food insecurity without talking about housing insecurity and vice versa. So I think Sacramento State does a really awesome job of providing that holistic experience for students experiencing housing and food insecurity.
And subsidized by the university? The question was, is that subsidized by the university?
So I believe that it first originated from the student government at Sacramento State. I'm seeing a head nod, so I think that's correct. And then I believe their case management vice president's office is then funding that room to be available for the duration of that period. And so I know that that room is being used quite often, and so they're also looking at partnerships with hotels and motels in the area, which is definitely a recommendation for the community college schools that don't have residence halls on campus.
One of the things I realized in this day and a half is that while we've been talking about student populations, and I don't want to break students into subpopulations, there hasn't been much discussion about veterans. And I recently got the pleasure of being the supervisor of our Veteran Services Coordinator, who is a wealth of information about services and resources available to vets who are also a high population that experience homelessness. And because I had a student who was about to experience housing insecurity, worked with this veterans office who was able to find some additional subsidies for this individual and then to help them secure housing. So it's one of the areas that I think that it's not often reporting to Student Affairs, so not all of us may interact with Veteran Services, but they have a lot of resources available for veterans, family of veterans, 911 vets, and I would suggest that that would be a relationship that you would want to develop as you continue to build your programs to serve students with housing insecurity on your campuses.
Great, thank you all. So what do administrators need to know about student housing insecurity from the campus's viewpoint? So I know that often some of us that are doing the work and we get to see these students that are struggling, maybe those that are higher up don't quite understand the seriousness and how the impact is on them. So what do we need to let them know about?
We have heard consistently today and probably yesterday that it's important to have data, and it is important to have data, because when you're talking to senior administrators, they're looking at the breadth of the university's functions and operations and not just the reporting areas that we come from. So in my case, it would be student affairs. But the human component that everybody's talked about is very important. To get those stories about students, their experiences, their successes as a result of the services that are provided to help them with food insecurity or home insecurity is really important to share. I've worked at both public and private institutions, and sometimes you get more of an opportunity to be in front of a board of trustees at a private institution, and often they are the ones who are very moved by the statements. I think that it's another component that administration may not think about when they're trying to increase their student recruitment efforts across the board. So a lot of schools, mine included right now, are recruiting a lot of first-generation students, recruiting a lot of international students, and when that recruitment plan, I think it's important for them to understand that the populations that they are recruiting, for very good reasons they want them on our campuses, are also the ones who may be most vulnerable to both food and housing insecurity. And that's a reality that they should know going into creating any kind of strategic plan to recruit and bring these students in, because they want them to be successful. But in order to be successful, they have to understand the complete demographic that they may be recruiting and have the services in place for them.
And if I can add to Meg's comment, student success is about these non-academic barriers. A student will not persist and complete and graduate or transfer if they don't have these non-academic barriers taken into account. And so when you're going to your administrations, having the data to correlate these graduation rates with students that receive services is very beneficial when you're trying to set programs up that may encompass campuses or systems within a state.
I think lastly, I think college administrators, they just need to recognize that, like right now, like a high school degree just isn't what it used to be. You really do need a college education. You need a college degree to make enough money to have that housing stability. So we always tell folks, you know, like the statistics definitely don't lie, but as of 2010, over 95% of jobs that have been created have only gone to college-educated workers. And it's expected that in 2 years, in 2020, 65% of jobs will require that education beyond a high school degree. So really, in order to get these students out of homelessness, to get out of that cycle of poverty, we need to get them to college, but they also need to graduate from college. So we need to provide the appropriate resources available for them.
So what are some possible policy changes that could happen at the campus level that might help address this issue?
Some of the promising practices that we're seeing that are out-of-the-box thinking include the students who are living in their cars to be able to park in our parking structures where it's secured, and the police oversee that at night so they're safe. Other things that we're seeing are tiny houses being looked at as an opportunity for students to live in, modular housing, collaborations with youth hostels where they can stay up to 30 days in a hostel close by, also with hotels for vouchers through emergency funds. So we're looking at all of those possibilities as solutions to this epidemic of the housing insecurities that we're seeing in our students.
And I think Jeanne mentioned earlier, so through their application system, the CCC Apply, being able to have that information for students to self-disclose if they are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, to note that, and then throughout that time period, the administration can, track and identify these students and provide them with resources. I think other things to do, as Barbara talked about, my executive director, the last session in addressing student homelessness, the obstacle that students are facing with the FAFSA and getting verified every year. That's always a huge hurdle, and the FAFSA just came out in October, and our email has just been just flooded with all these questions about getting re-verified, and just it's a really, really difficult process for those students. I think another thing, just for the administration to be committed and to be aware that these students exist and that they're doing something to help these students. So Amarillo College in Texas, they just came out with this No Excuses 2020 campaign, and they're working to have a 70% graduation rate by 2020, and they're doing that through all sorts of different avenues, one of which is by tackling that student poverty barriers. So they created that Foundation Emergency Aid. They're partnering with food pantries, clothing closets, counseling centers, career centers. So they're doing everything to make their students successful. And I think for schools being able to make that public commitment just kind of shows where their mission is in helping these students.
If I can add one more point, is what I'm also seeing across our campuses are peer navigators, and those may be formerly homeless community college or college students that are now helping other homeless college students access services or community agencies within the college system.
That's great. So I'm going to take you guys up a level. So how can policymakers at the state and federal level help us address this problem? Because it's bigger than just a campus level issue. It's a national issue. So how do we get policy changes, and what does that look like?
To quote somebody from this morning, vote. I think it is large, scale, and it is a societal issue, and I would hope that higher education can take the lead, not just in serving our students on this issue, but in educating society. I think we have to be community partners ourselves to realize that this is a larger issue and to influence our legislators, our local, state, and federal legislators and policymakers to really understand the toll that it takes on our society and our youth, K through 12 as well as all the way through higher education, on not having proper shelter in order to succeed.
So there are some current state laws that help students experiencing homelessness. Typically, or in particular, California has a lot of really great state laws. So one of which is California, or AB 801, in which I see that Jeanne has it up. And so that designates a homeless higher education liaison on a college campus, and they're just solely dedicated to helping support these homeless individuals on their campus with finding resources. And I know a lot of different colleges and institutions have that person as well, but I think having that state mandate, that state legislation really pushes, and hopefully other states can follow through with that model.
If I can add to that, there's actually a brochure that's out by California Community Colleges called the Guidelines for Community Colleges College Homeless Youth Liaison, and it sort of gives a front-to-back working document to allow you how to access that and the resources that are provided within it.
Great. So in doing some of this work, who are some of the key campus and community partners that can help us get this policy change at the campus, state, and federal level? Or help us with this work in general terms, maybe not even policy change?
Sure. So I worked in housing for 3 years prior to this role, and I think having folks on campus in housing, especially if it is a four-year institution, they are really great advocates. They can incorporate those emergency housing programs, whether it is going the route for, saying we need to keep these spaces for emergencies, for students of concerns, or at my previous institution, we just had a lot of facilities issues, and so it just made sense for us to keep a few spaces on campus where if a facility issue or emergency came, we can have the students be on campus rather than paying, hundreds of dollars for work to be done. I think other key folks are the case managers, the counselors, the people that are working with the students like every day on the different struggles and obstacles that they're facing. Obviously, we've heard with the session yesterday about how we just have a different student population now. We're more diverse than we ever have. So when considering the different intersections of identity, the students who are most vulnerable in experiencing homelessness, we need to keep in mind the people of color, the folks who are part of the LGBT community. So tapping into those offices because they might be working and interacting with these students, and we might not even know that they exist. I think training with faculty and staff to help with referrals. So a lot of the schools that I've talked to, that's how they're finding the students experiencing homelessness is through a faculty member or through a staff member. They just hear about a student mentioning something. So by creating these clear referral systems and getting them to the appropriate people, I think those are really helpful key partners, as well as also the librarians or the campus police or the safety folks. They're the people that are walking around at night and they might see folks who might be sleeping on a bench or sleeping in their car. So make sure that you're training those folks so, again, they can give the appropriate resources to the students. And then lastly, and this is for folks that are off campus, but I think establishing that partnership with the McKinney-Vento liaisons in the K-12 system. So there is a person in the K-12 system that works with students who are homeless, so why wouldn't there be one in post-secondary as well? So I think ensuring a warm handoff between that transition to secondary to post-secondary piece would be really instrumental.
And again, if I can add, health and wellness seems to play a key role. So your physicians, your nurses, your nurse practitioners, your psychologists for the schools that have psychiatrists, they are a key role in building this liaison for students. In addition, of course, we want to include our case managers, student life. So many times student life is not included, and they really are the voice of our campus. So having the peer-to-peer navigators be part of student clubs, student voices. Residential hall, RAs, if you have a facility that has, or an institution that has residential halls. And of course, as Jillian mentioned, our campus police, our key partners, our BIT teams, the behavioral intervention team are key partners that should be involved in these. Typically, we see if a student is bubbling up in one area, they're bubbling up in several areas. So having the BIT team involved has always been very beneficial. My senior administration has been very supportive. I think encourage anyone at a dean or a level that can make a difference to embark on empowering the senior administration levels to see, and also to include your board of trustees, because your board of trustees can be instrumental in making programs happen across your campuses.
One other group that I'd like to add, especially from the senior leadership perspective, is lots of times your vice president for student affairs and or your dean of students serves as a member, you're often a non-voting member for the faculty senate student affairs committee. And so I think it's really important, especially with shared governance and because we're concerned about student success on the academic realm, that whoever that person is representing students at the faculty senate be able to bring these concerns to the subcommittee first, and then it'll get to the full faculty senate, so that faculty are aware of the needs, the resources, and then how to reach out and partner with all of the other departments on campus. And then it was already mentioned, though, grounds crews, facilities, and other faculty who get into research buildings really early, sometimes walk in and find students, and, students are trying to act like they got there early when the building opened, but many times the reality is that they found a way to get into the building and stay there when the building was closed, and that's where they spent their night. And so getting your faculty to understand and look for signs that somebody may be experiencing these these security issues around housing and food, so that they can then connect them with the resources on campus as well. The one thing I would also say, having been in charge of health services, is please don't take it for granted that clinicians, your physicians, your nurses, and everybody are asking the questions to identify food insecurity or housing insecurity. It's not in the typical protocol for college health, and so part of it is we have to educate even the clinicians to ask those questions. My experience is the psychiatrists catch it first, but the rest, it should be a part of the standard protocol, in my opinion, that everybody knows how to really screen for these concerns for our students and not be just looking for disease or absence of disease, but the other areas that are feeding their anxiety, their depression, and their lack of success.
Great, thank you. So how do we ensure that we have students involved in the discussions around housing insecurities? Students bring a lot of passion to issues, and that passion is a great driving force for change a lot of times, much more powerful than maybe any of us at this table. So how do we get students involved in those discussions and then give them the tools that they need to help move this issue along and make some change?
So I think by having a student perspective, if there's a homeless task force on your campus, making sure that students are involved, because that's their lived experiences. They're going to be the ones that know what's going to work on their campus. I was at and I know this conference has been mentioned many times before, but at the #RealCollege conference 2 weeks ago, I was so surprised to see the amount of students that were there. So it was about 500 participants, and 72 of which were students, which I think was really awesome. They were able to provide, their experiences, they presented, but I think we need to have them more involved in the conversation. It just can't be administration making all the calls. I know you mentioned the peer navigators, which I really do love. I think peer-to-peer mentoring and peer-to-peer just anything is always really, really great. Having RAs host programs about food and housing insecurity, I think, is also really helpful, especially during those times where the break period, where a lot of students might go home for like a long weekend or for Thanksgiving, but the residence halls are still open. So I think, having those conversations with the folks who are still around and providing, again, probably also food, because there's always like food at RA programs. And I think in terms of empowering students, one student in particular at the Real College conference said, I have all the empowerment at this point. Like, I don't need to be empowered. I need the school to support me. And that really resonated me, because I do think a lot of students do have the vigor, they do have the passion, and they're willing to fight and work for it. But at times, like, where does the college meet them, and how can they support them in what they need?
Yeah, I would add to that, so as advisor to Student Government Association, I sometimes have some of that inside information about the struggles of our students and the student body that perhaps the elected student leadership does not have. And so I will feed them the information and let them know what some of the pressing issues are on campus that they may not be aware of because they're not experiencing it, and then turn that information over to them and hope that they will take the leadership. There's a little guidance in helping them take that leadership to address some of the concerns. So they're another really important group of student leaders who can be effective, because in a lot of colleges, if not most, not only does the student government president report to the senior student affairs president, but they often have monthly meetings with the president or chancellor of the university, and they attend board meetings. So bringing the awareness to them, let them help with the program or let them have a voice in it, but sometimes we have to provide them with information that's not always in their sphere of experience. And so they would be a good partner to work with.
Again, student life is very important to bring to the table. Have the students be involved in the food pantries, have the students in the peer-to-peer navigation, as we've mentioned, have the students running the secondhand clothing store, having them be involved in housing options, letting them be at the table to meet with organizations like Stand Up for Kids, which helps to house children and young adults 18 to 24. Those are all organizations that we utilize in order to meet some of the needs and to make sure that we have student involvement, because it really is their voice that we're trying to bring to the table.
Thank you all. So I think most campuses struggle with housing options over break. Maybe students have to leave over a winter break or a holiday break. And so how do campuses address that when maybe those students don't have somewhere else to go? And maybe some innovative things that you've heard of or seen happen.
Yeah, so with the homeless higher education liaisons that I mentioned, in the California law, they also should be coming up with a plan to house these students over the break period. So typically over winter break and summer break, that's where we're seeing where students don't have a place to go to. Some of the halls might close. And what's interesting is that the law doesn't necessarily explain how schools are supposed to be doing this. It's really kind of up to, dependent upon the institution, what resources they have. But we do see some best practices around the country, and some of those include, having an Airbnb for a handful of students to stay during those few weeks during the winter break period. Another option is for like house homes or host homes. So at DePaul in Chicago, they have something called, it's part of the Dax House program, where students can live with folks within the DePaul community. So it could just be folks that like live close to the school, really love the school. It could be alumni, but they actually will house a student experiencing homelessness for a quarter period, which is really, really awesome and really great. And they also just got a house this past year, so they can house about 6 to 8 students, I believe, during that period, which is really, really awesome. Other things that we could do in terms of housing is, I've mentioned again, using hotels and motels, providing emergency funds. If that's something that folks, they might be able to have a place or a friend to stay, but they might not be able to pay for that transportation cost. So tapping into emergency funds if that's available on your campus. Yep, yes, yep.
Oh, go ahead and Albert. Oh, there you go.
You had mentioned just some of the innovative ways to help students secure housing over breaks.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that may be managed by on-campus facilities, but you had mentioned like Airbnb,
Mm-hmm.
and part of me always thinks of like what could be the worst case scenario. So is there any thought to like, well, what's the liability for the university getting involved in an outside vendor or some kind of outside constituent that, let's say over break, there is some kind of emergency or a student makes a bad decision and, breaks the law. Has that come up in conversation at all?
It really does depend upon the institution. So I know at my previous institution, they actually now just rent a whole bunch of hotel rooms on campus, and that's how they're able to provide students for housing. But before, they were using Airbnbs, and then they had that issue of like, okay, what happens if like the power goes out or something happens to a student? What do we do? Because at that point in time, I was working on housing, and we don't have on-call staff, and so they had to create like a mini on-call staff with the folks that were available. But I think it really is dependent upon the institution. I know some schools toyed around with the host home idea, but then their legal team got involved and they said there's too much liability. So I think it's working with your institution in particular about what is feasible and what's not. But no, that's a really great question.
Yes, you have to be very careful if you're using the same institutions, especially with things like Title IX, Clery reporting, WAVA, things that we're looking at as far as, so having those conversations and having at the table your campus police, your chief, so that they can add that input is vital in these conversations. Some of the things that foundation accounts can help if you create a 503c foundation account and you can use that. There are waivers that can be signed that you run through your risk management department in order to have if a student is going to be using Uber instead of yellow, or, instead of taxi cabs. There's a liability associated with that as well. So Uber is on every one of our phones probably as an app, and we can transport students, especially students with domestic violence or that are going into transition housing that way. But we have to think about the liability for the institution. So working closely with your risk management department in order to facilitate what would be acceptable to them and what liabilities they're willing to take on and not is a great resource.
I think also when you're thinking about doing some of these programs with these community groups, facilities, is to remember that, we talked about it earlier, that especially first gen students I think it was the panel, 2 panels ago, that talked about you give them all the resources, but they don't know how to use them. So you're talking also with a vulnerable population who has not gotten used to navigating a lot of systems in the community. Think about your foster care students who are aged out. And so it's very important to make sure that if you do any of those agreements or memorandum of understandings with Airbnbs or hotels, that there's somebody there to still help the student to navigate that process and those resources that are available to them. I also would say that for residence halls, that do close over breaks. I've always been astounded that we find a way to be open for certain groups of students over breaks because they're traveling or they're going to represent the university at a tournament. Not to specify who that might be, but, and they have also with them some maybe special food arrangements for them because of the reason they're staying on campus. But if you say, okay, so the residence halls are open, so why can't some of these other students stay there? You also then have to go the next step and talk to your food vendor to make sure that dining is open. I have been or worked at campuses where the residence halls get to stay open over breaks, but there's no place for the students to eat. And if you're in a metro area, that may or may not work for them, but if you're in a rural location, they're stuck on campus with no food. So now you've maybe given them some temporary housing, but you've created food insecurity because there's no place for them to eat. Their meal plans are not active when the school is closed. So there's a lot of details to put in place as you're developing these resources. The other thing on longer breaks is to remember that residence halls are auxiliary services on campus. That means they're supposed to create income. And so especially over the summers, they may decrease the number of housing slots available to students so that they can host camps and conferences and other things. And so it's about understanding that and balancing it. And that's where your data and your stories come through to convince your administration that there's more housing needs for your students, prospective or current students, and work with them to be able to make it manageable for those students.
Thank you all. I'm going to go to Kellen. We have a question online.
How are you going about identifying homeless students without creating a stigma?
Yeah, so I think there are, and that's something, we actually just created a tip sheet that is focused on outreach and identification. And so I think a lot of schools right now are starting to ask that question of, do you experience homelessness or any sort of housing insecurity? But the framing of that question is really important. And I've seen it in so many different ways. So I know CCC Apply, they have a question on homelessness. I know Cal State Apply has something about homelessness as well. And then the Georgia, the Common App that they're going to be using, it's going to be coming out in a few years. How they're framing it is like, check all that apply, and then it puts a list of different identities. So it might be, are you a veteran? Are you a former foster youth? Are you, and I think how they phrase it in terms of for homelessness, they say, have you ever received services from the McKinney-Vento, or as defined by the McKinney-Vento Act? So I think it's all about framing, because a lot of students, they don't identify as homelessness. They don't know what that definition is. They just, like, oh, I'm staying with a friend for a few nights. I'm not homeless. I have a roof over my head. And that's something that I think everyone is still trying to figure out how do we get rid of that stigma? How do we make that aware to the students? I think just kind of normalizing that homelessness, students experiencing homelessness do exist on your campus. And again, my executive director mentioned this yesterday, but for faculty members, they can easily just put something in their syllabus in the beginning of the year. They can talk about it, just, a few sentences saying, if you are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity or food insecurity, you can contact me or the appropriate resource. And just by saying that statement, I think that just kind of brings that awareness for folks who might not be even aware that those students do exist. And I think also just there is always the Homelessness Awareness Week that's around like Thanksgiving time. So doing really appropriate and intentional programs during that time period. Other ways it's just, creating referral systems. So partnering with your faculty and staff members and making sure that they're talking about this issue and it's not just siloed to one office that does all the homeless work. It should really be integrated amongst the campus community.
I think normalizing it and not having it as a stigma is really important. We have a lot of data now that we can pull from. The NCHA survey questions are coming up, Health Services Association, #RealCollege survey. I mean, we're looking at this now and able to get numbers. So I think the more that we get it out there, the more we talk to our students, the more we make the resources available, the less stigma that is related, because the students don't relate to the term homeless. Most of our students relate to housing insecure. Couch surfing is a norm, and they say, oh, I'm just couch surfing for a few days, or I don't have a place tonight, but I have a place tomorrow night. So we're seeing that. I think the more awareness that we have in the colleges about those terms, the better we will be.
I remembered another thing too. So partnering up with financial aid is also a really, really great way to identify students. And so I've seen this done in a few different ways. One school in particular, they get a list of all the students that have marked down that they're independent. So that could be students who are married, students who are over 24, students who are unaccompanied homeless youth. There's a whole 6 different bullet points on why you might be considered an independent student. And so from that, the different specific offices will reach out to those students and say, hey, you're marked down as an independent student. These are all the resources that we have on your campus. Please feel free to reach out to us. And then another way is just partnering with, and I know sometimes financial aid can find that information, and then they can then just work with them if they might qualify or be eligible for specific programs or scholarship opportunities. So I think partnering with financial aid is really, really, really helpful, but it really does depend on the institution to establish those relationships because, again, at the Real College Conference, we were talking about financial aid so much and how much they matter and how much we really need them as advocates and allies, but they really weren't in the room. So I think we don't automatically think as financial aid as people to bring into this conversation, and they really need to be part of it.
Great. So this session, along with the past couple of days, we've talked a lot about short-term solutions, long-term solutions. So I just wanted to get everyone's thoughts on which short-term solutions you think are viable for campuses that are maybe just getting into this. Some long-term solutions maybe for those that have their foot in the water, but they haven't done the full plunge yet. And then along with that, how do campuses secure these things so that we don't continue to have this problem escalate as we go forward?
A couple of things that I was thinking with the long and short term. For short term, I think the movement that we have seen across our campuses is significant for food pantries, MOUs, partnerships, farmers market. Those help with our food insecurities on a short-term basis. Sustaining that is another opportunity that we have to look at because we want to make sure that if we start something, we're able to sustain it. So for long term, I think policy making and legislation and getting out and voting and making sure that these are bringing, utilizing the AB, 801s, the Senate bills that come through in order to promote opportunities for our students is vital. So I think for short term, it's putting solutions in place that meet the needs currently, and long term, making policy changes that maybe carve out language specific for these housing insecure and food insecure students.
Something that we're seeing as a long-term solution is the use of emergency funds, and I know that is really dependent upon the institution. Some of the times it's just emergency loans where the students have to pay back, it's kind of silly because like if a student has the money then now, like why do you think they're gonna have the money to pay in like 30 days later? So. There has been a lot of research in terms of how emergency funds, how they can help with retention. So what we're seeing is that sometimes emergencies happen, whether it's a car breaks down, medical bills, need to pay utilities or something, and students might need like $300, $400 right then in that moment. And so they're grappling with, okay, like I need to pay this large amount of money, but I also have to go to school. More often than not, they'll just kind of drop out because they don't think they have any other option because they need to pay that bill then and there. And so for schools to be able to provide this emergency fund, they're able to actually increase their retention because they just needed, like, again, those $300, $400 at that time. And so at Barrett College in New York, they actually are tracking this information, and they noticed that in comparison to their 61% retention rate on their campus community, folks who use the emergency fund, it went up to 81%, which is just absolutely drastic. And I know other schools are starting to track this information now, and I think that's also just a big piece that's missing is some schools are just starting to be aware that these students are existing, but we aside from the Hope College and the different surveys that are being sent out, whether it's on a systems level like the California system or institutionally, we really don't have a lot of data on these students at all. But I think emergency funds are really, really helpful, and they really do depend on the institution. So I know some schools have restrictions on where the money can go. So some of them, it can't go to tuition at all. Sometimes you need to exhaust all your financial aid funds before you can tap into the emergency fund. So it really is dependent upon the school. And again, at the Real College Conference, we talked about this issue for about 15 minutes because there was just so much confusion around where and when you can use the funds, and we really need that financial aid perspective to give that guidance.
So how do housing and food insecurities fit in with Healthy Campus 2030 as we're getting ready to embark on drafting up the Healthy Campus 2030?
The purpose of Healthy Campus 2020 was to provide all of us with a framework to identify our priorities and then to address those priorities that impact student health and wellness. We have an opportunity with 2030, which is just beginning. There is a nice framework for us to start looking at to move forward. And to me, if we are investing in student well-being and providing frameworks for colleges to use to help student success through health and wellness and well-being, that 2030 is a great opportunity for ACHA to take the lead on this issue of food insecurity and housing insecurity. So I'm hoping that that will be included in the 2030 plan. If you look at the 2020 plan, we have lots of guidelines about helping students address stress, anxiety, ATOD, tobacco, but nothing about their food insecurity or housing insecurities. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to develop a meaningful plan that a lot of colleges can buy into. I think that the vision is for us with 2030 to connect and work with our other organizations, NERSA, NASPA, and some of the other student-focused organizations, and to actually have liaisons working with those organizations. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to include these very important issues into 2030.
I couldn't have agreed better. That was so well said, wasn't it? One of the other organizations that I think that people fail to look at the data, and especially resident of men of color, and is the SEAL data, and that's out of the Community Equity Assessment Lab out of San Diego, California, and they have incredible resources on food and housing insecurities for men of color, women of color, and some of our different populations that also get not included in some of the surveys directly.
Great. So what are some of the best practices that you've seen kind of around the country in addressing this? And then for those that are online viewing, if you work there, just get ready for all the emails that might be coming your way, just to preface that.
I think some of the best practices that I've seen personally are the food pantries, the farmers markets, the secondhand clothing stores, the free distribution of toiletries, CalFresh being accessible on the health centers or on the campuses so students can access and obtain their applications for CalFresh benefits or SNAP benefits. Cafeterias honoring those as part of their meal plan, letting students being able to utilize those. In addition, I see partnerships, a lot of the community partnerships, where some of the common practices are the hosting of families. I've seen that as some of the best practices too. A Rising Star program where alumni will take on a student for a semester. Some of the other practices that I've seen are programs that through the foundation that allow students to have their parking paid, changing in our textbooks because so many of our students can't afford textbooks to online OEI education instruments are wonderful. So for best practices, I think that all of these are wonderful opportunities for our students to be successful because they are our future. I look at the students that I have today, and in 20 years or 30 years, they're going to be doing what I'm doing. And I hope that the help that I give them now allows them to provide that for others in the future.
I would add that, I'm sorry,
No, go
that
for
the
it.
best practice is yet to be developed and may be sitting in this room.
Yeah.
So while I embrace the idea of best practices, I also think that we look so hard for best practices that we fail to create best practices. So I would encourage you to be creative and be that next best practice. And you may be building off of another program that's in place, but please be creative because you probably have the answers. Actually, your students have the answers, so you just need to ask the questions.
Yeah, so I mentioned our tip sheets that we have, but we just created 5 tip sheets that do highlight some really great work the schools are doing around the country. And so they focus on the transition from high school to college, identifying homeless college students, housing on and off campus, accessing financial aid, and creating and sustaining campus-based programs. So I have little half sheets for the folks here, but if you go onto our website, you can download the PDF. And these are living documents. So again, a lot of my work is just talking to individuals in the colleges to figure out what's going on, what's doing well at your school. So feel free to contact me if you are doing some really great work at your school, and I can update these documents. But I think some of the best practices, including having that homeless higher education liaison, that designated point of contact at your school that is just solely focused on helping students experiencing homelessness. Because, it is silly that one exists in the K through 12 system, but then once that person goes to college, where do they go? So having that person is really, really helpful. I think having, comprehensive support programs, or some schools call them care teams, I think those are also really great because they're able to do referrals to the different resources that are on campus. I think utilizing any sort of partnerships that are in the community, both on campus or outside of campus. There's this one woman, she's a designated point of contact. She was in Washington, but she was like, I noticed that we had a housing problem on our campus. There wasn't any spaces on the school, or it might have been a community college. So she tapped into what she had in the city that she was living in. And so she actually partnered with retirement homes, which I never would have thought about in a million years. So what she was able to do is she noticed that she was able to use maybe a few spaces that were available. The students pay maybe $200, $250 a month, and then they work at the retirement home in volunteer hours, and then they're able to stay there. And I think that was such a really unique, really cool, very out-of-the-box solution, but just utilizing what you have in your community. Yeah, no, I think very similarly, Meg, I think the best practices are still yet to come. utilizing and learning from our students. They're our future, so hopefully we'll learn from them.
Well, I would like to thank the panel for all this insight, and if there was any one thing in the last maybe 1 minute that anybody in the audience, in person or on the panel, wanted to share that we have not addressed in the last 2 days, it's been a wealth of information. I think everybody has a lot of great takeaways, but if there was anything else, we have maybe a minute if anybody wanted to volunteer something else. Otherwise, I am going to get ready to turn it back over to Kellen. All right. Well, thank you all again for joining us, audience members, those that are live streaming. This is the end of the discussion for the Creating a Foundation for Wellbeing, addressing our students' food and shelter needs. I'm going to go ahead and let Kellen close this out.
I'd like to just take a minute to thank our incredible panelists and moderators for lending their time and expertise today and making our summit a great success. Thank you to all of those who are watching remotely and to everybody who is in the room as well. Obviously, we will not be able to resolve all of these issues in a 2-day summit. However, our goal was to plant some seeds of innovation. I think we've done that. But the hard work now is for all of you listening to take these seeds, nurture them, and grow them into real solutions on your campuses. From today's conference, we will be putting up a recorded version of this event on the ACHA website. For those that were not able to attend or who would like to watch again, we will send out a link over the next 2 weeks and would encourage you to share it with others. Additionally, I'd like to also encourage you to please look to our supporting organizations for the innovative work that they are doing to help universities advance in this arena. Finally, to all of you listening over the past 2 days who give tirelessly to your student health and well-being on your campus, I want to offer our sincerest thank you for the incredible hard work that you do. I urge you to continue your efforts to be innovative in your own work and to share it back the results with ACHA members and all of your colleagues going forward. With that, we'll conclude this summit, and I wish everyone safe travels home. Thank you for joining us.